The first time I unlocked the front door of my grandparents' house, I stood there for nearly 5 minutes without stepping inside. Not because I was nervous, because every corner of that old farmhouse held a memory. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 38 years old, and until 2 years ago, I lived in a busy flat in Birmingham, working 12-hour days as a civil engineer. Life had become a routine. Wake up, fight traffic, work, go home exhausted, repeat. Then one phone call changed everything. My grandmother, Margaret, passed away peacefully at the age of 86. She had outlived my grandfather by nearly 11 years. They had owned the same countryside property for almost half a century. To most people, it was just an old farmhouse sitting on 5 acres of land. To me, it was home. Every school holiday had been spent there. I learned to ride my first bicycle along its gravel driveway. My grandfather taught me how to plant vegetables in the back garden. My grandmother made the best apple pie I'd ever tasted. Whenever life became overwhelming, that house reminded me what peace felt like. A few weeks after the funeral, their solicitor called. "Daniel, your grandparents left the property entirely to you." I was speechless. I hadn't expected anything, certainly not the house. When the paperwork was complete, I made a decision many people thought was crazy. I sold my flat in Birmingham, packed everything I owned into a small moving van, and started over. Friends tried talking me out of it. "You're leaving the city? For a village? What about your career? What about opportunities?" I simply smiled. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing promotions or bigger salaries. I was chasing something far more valuable: peace. The village of Ashford Hollow had fewer than 800 residents. There was one primary school, a small grocery shop, a family-run cafe, and a church that had stood for over 100 years. Everyone seemed to know everyone. Within my first week, people I'd never met were waving as I drove past. An elderly couple brought over homemade bread. The local butcher refused to let me pay full price because "Your grandfather helped fix my tractor 20 years ago." It felt like stepping back into a different world. The property itself needed work. The roof had several loose tiles. The barn doors barely closed. Half the garden had become overgrown. But none of that bothered me. Every repair felt personal, almost like honoring my grandparents' memory. Each morning, I'd make coffee, walk the property, and slowly plan the next project. Some days it was repairing fences. Other days it was clearing old flower beds. There was no rush. For the first time in years, I actually enjoyed Mondays. The only neighboring property shared my eastern boundary. A large brick house sat roughly 200 meters away. Its owner introduced himself on my second day. "Morning!" a cheerful voice called from across the fence. I looked up to see a tall man walking toward me. He appeared to be in his late 50s, broad shoulders, expensive boots, perfectly pressed shirt despite working outdoors. He extended his hand confidently. "I'm Gary Mitchell, the fellow next door." I shook his hand. "Daniel Harper. Nice to meet you." He smiled warmly. "Your grandparents were wonderful people. They'll be missed." For the next half hour, Gary couldn't have been friendlier. He pointed out the best fishing spots nearby, recommended local tradesmen, even offered to lend me his tractor if I needed help clearing the old paddock. As he walked back toward his property, I remember thinking, I've been lucky. Good neighbors can make all the difference. I had absolutely no reason to doubt him. Over the following weeks, we crossed paths regularly. Sometimes he'd wave while mowing his lawn. Other times we'd chat for a few minutes over the fence. He seemed to know everyone in the village, People greeted him politely, although I noticed something strange. The conversations never lasted very long. Whenever Gary walked away, the smiles disappeared. At first, I assumed I was imagining it. One Saturday afternoon, I visited the village cafe. While waiting for my tea, the owner, Mrs. Collins, smiled. "Settling in all right?" "I am." "Beautiful property you've inherited." "It is." She hesitated for a second, then quietly asked, "How are things with Gary?" I laughed. "So far, so good." She forced a smile. "That's nice." Before I could ask what she meant, another customer walked in. The conversation ended there. A few days later, I experienced another odd moment. I was trimming hedges along the eastern boundary when Gary wandered over carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you could use a break." "Thanks." We stood talking for nearly 20 minutes, mostly about gardening, weather, village life. Then he casually looked toward the old timber fence separating our properties. "You know, that fence has never been in quite the right place." I looked over. "It hasn't," he shrugged. "My father always said the actual boundary sits a few feet further this way." He pointed toward my garden. I frowned. "I've got the property documents somewhere." Gary chuckled. "Oh, I'm sure it'll sort itself out." Then he changed the subject completely. At the time, I thought nothing of it. That evening, while unpacking old boxes from the attic, I discovered a worn leather folder labeled simply, "Property Records." Inside were decades of documents, original deeds, insurance papers, hand-drawn sketches, receipts dating back to the 1980s. Among them was an official land survey completed 12 years earlier. I unfolded the large map across the dining table. The eastern boundary was clearly marked, exactly where the existing fence stood. I smiled to myself. Mystery solved. I carefully folded the survey and placed it back inside the folder. The next morning, I left early to collect building materials from a nearby town. It was a simple trip, just fencing supplies and timber for repairing the old barn. I returned shortly after lunchtime. As my van turned into the driveway, something immediately felt wrong. I couldn't explain why. Everything looked almost the same. The house, the trees, the barn. Then I saw it. The fence. I slammed on the brakes. Several sections along the eastern boundary looked different. New timber posts. Fresh concrete. The fence hadn't just been repaired. It had been moved. And unless my eyes were deceiving me, it now stood several feet inside my property. I climbed out of the van and walked slowly toward it. The fresh soil around the new posts was still damp. Someone had done the work that very morning. Then I noticed something else. Gary was standing in his garden, watching me. He smiled, raised a hand, and calmly shouted across the fence, "Looks much better now, doesn't it?" I stared at him in disbelief, because I was almost certain he hadn't just repaired the boundary. He'd stolen part of my land. For several seconds, I simply stood there staring at the new fence. It wasn't just 1 or 2 posts that had been replaced. The entire eastern boundary had shifted. The old weathered fence my grandfather had repaired countless times was gone. In its place stood fresh timber panels, secured with brand new concrete posts. Someone had spent hours doing the work, and according to my eyes, they had stolen nearly 3 meters of my garden. Gary leaned casually against his own fence. "What do you think?" I walked closer. "I think you've built this on my property." He laughed. "No, I moved it onto the correct boundary." I frowned. "Based on what?" "My father's notes." I looked at him. "I've got an official survey from 12 years ago. He shrugged. Then your survey is wrong. His confidence caught me off guard. Most people would have at least suggested checking the paperwork together. Gary didn't. He spoke as though the matter had already been settled. I took a slow breath. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. So am I. He smiled. When you realize the fence is in the right place. Then he walked back toward his house, leaving me standing there. That evening, I spread every property document across my dining table. The original deeds, the land survey, my grandparents' purchase records. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The boundary hadn't changed in decades. The fence Gary had installed was well inside my property. I measured the distance using the survey. Just under 3 meters. Along nearly 60 meters of boundary. It wasn't a small mistake. It was a strip of land almost the size of a tennis court. The next morning, I knocked on Gary's front door. He answered almost immediately, holding a cup of tea, as though he'd been expecting me. I've checked the paperwork. So have I. The fence is on my land. No, it isn't. I unfolded the survey. Look, he didn't even glance at it. I don't need to. My father knew exactly where the boundary was. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So, you're ignoring an official survey because of something your father said? Gary's smile disappeared. My father lived here 40 years. He knew this land better than anyone. I folded the survey. I think we should hire an independent surveyor. He crossed his arms. Waste your money if you like. The fence stays. Then he quietly closed the door. For the first time since moving to Ashford Hollow, I felt genuinely uneasy. Not because of the land itself. Because reasonable conversations weren't working. Over the next few days, things became even stranger. One afternoon, I looked out of my kitchen window and saw Gary parking his trailer on the strip of disputed land. The next day, he stacked building materials there. A week later, he began storing piles of timber against my side of the fence. It was as though he wanted everyone to believe the land had always belonged to him. I tried focusing on restoring the farmhouse, but every morning, the first thing I saw was that fence. And every morning, it seemed to creep a little further into my thoughts. Then something happened that changed everything. I returned from buying groceries one Saturday afternoon. Fresh tire tracks crossed my lawn. Deep ones. They hadn't been there that morning. Following them toward the eastern boundary, I discovered several of my newly planted flower beds had been crushed. A young apple tree I'd planted in memory of my grandfather had been snapped clean in half. I stood there in disbelief. The damage wasn't accidental. A vehicle had driven directly across my garden. Moments later, I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine. Gary's tractor emerged from behind his barn. Mud covered its tires. He waved cheerfully. Afternoon? I pointed toward the broken tree. Did you drive across my garden? He looked briefly at the damage. Oh, I was turning my trailer. You drove over my flowers. They're only flowers. You destroyed my tree. He shrugged. It was close to the boundary anyway. I couldn't believe how casually he dismissed it. That tree was planted on my land. Gary smiled. In your opinion? I stared at him. In my opinion? According to my documents. That's my land. That evening. I called the local police. An officer arrived about an hour later. He listened patiently while I explained everything. The moved fence, the damaged garden, the broken apple tree. He walked the boundary with both of us, then sighed. I'm afraid this is primarily a civil property dispute. I frowned. So there's nothing you can do? If someone intentionally damaged your property, that can be investigated. But determining who owns this strip of land is something only a surveyor or the courts can resolve. Gary stood nearby with his hands in his pockets, looking completely relaxed. As the officer prepared to leave, Gary smiled politely. "I'm sure we'll sort it out like good neighbors." The officer nodded. "I hope so." The moment the police car disappeared down the road, Gary looked at me. His friendly smile vanished instantly. "You should have stayed in Birmingham." I blinked. "What?" "People from cities think paperwork means everything." He stepped closer. "Out here, things are different." For the first time, I saw the real Gary Mitchell. The friendly neighbor I'd met weeks earlier had disappeared. Standing in front of me was someone completely different. Someone who wasn't interested in compromise. The following Monday, I called the surveying company that had completed my grandparents' land survey 12 years earlier. To my surprise, they still had copies of the original records. "We can send someone out this week. Please. The sooner the better." 3 days later, a licensed surveyor named Oliver Grant arrived carrying modern GPS equipment, historical boundary maps, and copies of the original survey. He spent nearly 6 hours walking the property, measuring distances, locating old boundary markers, comparing historical records with satellite coordinates. Gary watched from his garden the entire time, never once approaching, never once offering to discuss the results. As the sun began setting, Oliver walked back toward me, holding his clipboard. His expression was serious. "Mr. Harper, I've completed the measurements. And," he looked toward Gary's newly built fence, "I can tell you one thing with absolute certainty." He paused. "That fence is nowhere near the legal boundary." Before I could respond, Oliver frowned. "There's something else." "What?" "When I started this morning, there were 3 official survey stakes marking the original property line. Yes, they're gone." I looked around. He was right. Every bright orange marker he'd placed only hours earlier had disappeared. Someone had removed every single one. Oliver slowly turned toward Gary's property, then quietly said, "I think your boundary dispute just became a lot more serious." The next morning, I walked the entire eastern boundary before sunrise. Not because I expected anything to be different, because I wanted to see it with my own eyes. Oliver Grant had installed 3 bright orange survey stakes less than 24 hours earlier. Each one marked the legal property line using GPS coordinates accurate to within a few centimeters. Now, every single one had vanished. The ground where they'd stood had been disturbed. Fresh footprints covered the damp soil. Someone hadn't just removed them. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure they disappeared. I called Oliver immediately. "I've just checked. They're gone." He didn't sound surprised. "I was afraid you'd say that. What do we do?" "I'm coming back." An hour later, Oliver arrived carrying another set of survey markers. This time, he also brought a camera. He photographed the disturbed ground, measured the footprints, recorded the missing marker locations. Then he looked at me. "Mr. Harper, I've been surveying land for nearly 20 years. I've seen boundary disputes. I've seen neighbors disagree. But I've never seen someone remove official survey markers the same day they were installed. What does that mean?" He paused. "It usually means they already know they're wrong." Instead of replacing the orange stakes, Oliver installed steel reference pins several inches beneath the surface. Only a small metal cap remained visible. He smiled slightly. "These are much harder to remove." Then he leaned closer. "But I'd still recommend security cameras." By that afternoon, I'd ordered 4 high-definition cameras. One covered the driveway. One faced the barn. The other two overlooked the disputed boundary from different angles. As I mounted the final camera beneath the corner of the farmhouse roof, I noticed Gary watching from his garden. He folded his arms. "You expecting burglars?" I smiled politely. "No. I'm expecting honesty." His expression hardened. Then he turned around and walked away without another word. 3 nights passed quietly. Nothing unusual happened. I almost began wondering whether I'd overreacted. Then, at 2:17 on Thursday morning, my phone vibrated. Motion detected. East boundary. Still half asleep. I opened the security app. The infrared camera showed someone walking slowly along the fence. They were wearing a hooded jacket, gloves, and carrying a torch. I watched the live feed in silence. The person knelt beside one of Oliver's new boundary markers. For several seconds, they struggled with something. Then they stood up, walked away. The motion alert ended. I threw on a jacket and hurried outside. By the time I reached the boundary, whoever it was had already disappeared, but the steel survey marker was bent almost flat against the ground. Someone had tried to pry it out using a metal bar. They'd failed. Back inside, I replayed the footage repeatedly. The face wasn't visible, but one detail stood out immediately. The person had a noticeable limp, not severe, just enough to favor their right leg. The next morning, I happened to see Gary walking to his shed. He limped in exactly the same way. I refused to jump to conclusions. A limp wasn't proof. It was only a coincidence. Or at least, I wanted to believe it was. That afternoon, Oliver returned once again. After examining the damaged marker, he shook his head. This wasn't accidental. He photographed everything, then prepared an official incident report. What happens now? I recommend you keep documenting everything, and if it continues, he looked directly at me, then your solicitor will have an excellent case. The word solicitor stayed with me. Until then, I'd hoped we could solve everything peacefully. Now, that hope was beginning to fade. Later that evening, I visited the county records office. If this dispute was heading to court, I wanted every piece of evidence available. An elderly archivist named Helen helped me locate historical property maps dating back almost 70 years. We carefully unfolded one enormous survey from 1968. The faded ink was still perfectly readable. The eastern boundary appeared exactly where my grandparents' survey showed it, not where Gary's new fence stood. Then we found another survey. Same boundary, same boundary, same boundary. For more than half a century, the property line had never changed. Helen smiled kindly. Your grandfather was very particular. He updated every land record whenever improvements were made. He even kept copies with us. I laughed. That sounds like him. She tapped the old maps. These documents carry considerable weight. If anyone claims the boundary has always been elsewhere, they'll have a difficult time explaining these. As I left the records office, my confidence had returned. Facts mattered. Documents mattered. Eventually, the truth would matter. But Gary wasn't finished. Not even close. The following Saturday, I woke to the sound of chainsaws. At first, I assumed someone nearby was trimming trees. Then I looked out of my bedroom window. My heart nearly stopped. 2 workers were standing inside the disputed strip of land. One tree had already been cut down. Another had been marked with bright orange paint. Both oak trees had stood there for decades. My grandfather planted them the year I was born. I sprinted outside. "What are you doing?" One of the workers shut off his chainsaw. "Our boss told us these trees are coming down." "Who's your boss?" Before either man could answer, Gary walked around the corner carrying rolled-up building plans. He smiled. "Morning, Daniel." I pointed at the trees. "Those are on my property." He calmly unrolled the plans. "Not anymore." "What are those?" "My new garage." I stared at the drawings. According to the plans, the building would extend directly across the disputed land. Nearly half of it would stand where my grandfather's oak trees had grown for almost 40 years. I looked back at Gary. "You're seriously planning to build there, while the boundary is still in dispute?" He folded the plans with a confident smile. "By the time you convince anyone otherwise, the garage will already be finished." For the first time since moving to Ashford Hollow, I realized this was never just about a fence. Gary wasn't trying to borrow a few feet of land. He was trying to make the theft permanent. And if I didn't stop him immediately, there might soon be a brick garage sitting on property that had belonged to my family for generations. I didn't wait for another argument. The moment Gary mentioned building a garage, I drove straight to the local council offices. If he had planning permission, I needed to know. And if he didn't, I intended to stop construction before a single brick was laid. The planning department occupied a modest brick building in the center of Ashford Hollow. A planning officer named Sarah Bennett welcomed me into her office. "How can I help you today?" I explained everything. The moved fence, the missing survey markers, the planned garage. She listened carefully before typing Gary Mitchell's address into her computer. After a few moments, she frowned. "That's strange." "What is?" "There is an approved application for a detached garage." My stomach tightened. "So he can build?" She shook her head. "Not exactly." She turned her monitor so I could see. The approved plans place the garage entirely within Mr. Mitchell's registered boundary. She pointed to the digital map. "If he's building where you've described, he'll be outside the approved footprint." For the first time that day, I smiled. "So if he builds on my land, he's violating planning permission?" Sarah nodded. "Potentially, yes. But first we'll need to inspect the site." 2 days later, construction began anyway. Just after 8 in the morning, a concrete mixer rolled into Gary's driveway. 2 lorries followed, carrying bricks and steel beams. Within an hour, workers were digging foundation trenches, exactly where my grandfather's oak trees had once stood. I walked over immediately. The site foreman introduced himself as Mark Davies. "I'm Daniel Harper. Have you seen the property survey?" He looked confused. "No. Mr. Mitchell told us the boundary dispute was already settled." "It isn't." I handed him copies of Oliver's survey. Mark studied the documents silently, then looked toward Gary. "You never mentioned any of this." Gary marched over before Mark could say another word. "Those papers mean nothing. The council approved my plans." I replied calmly. "They approved plans for your property, not mine." Mark removed his hard hat. "I'm stopping work until this is sorted." Gary's face reddened. "You'll do no such thing." Mark folded the survey and handed it back to me. "I'm not risking my license over a property dispute." Within minutes, his crew packed away their equipment. The concrete mixer drove off without pouring a single load. Gary watched thousands of pounds worth of equipment disappear down the road. His eyes never left me. That evening, my phone rang. It was Sarah Bennett. "We carried out today's inspection. And? The foundations your neighbor marked extend approximately 2.5 meters beyond his approved building area. What happens now?" "We've issued an immediate stop work notice." Relief washed over me. Finally, someone else had confirmed what I'd been saying all along. I assumed Gary would back down. Instead, he doubled down. 3 days later, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery again. This time, he wasn't digging foundations. He was clearing land. By lunchtime, another section of hedgerow separating our properties had disappeared. So had several mature shrubs that had stood there for decades. He wasn't building the garage. He was preparing the land anyway. I photographed everything. Every fallen tree, every damaged hedge, every tire track. Oliver had been right. Document everything, no matter how small. Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man parked outside my farmhouse and slowly walked to the front door. He introduced himself as Arthur Collins. I used to own the property beyond Gary's. I invited him inside. Over coffee, he glanced toward the eastern boundary. "I heard you're having trouble." "You could say that." Arthur sighed. "You're not the first." He reached into an old leather briefcase and removed several faded photographs. The first showed the boundary from nearly 20 years earlier. The fence stood exactly where Oliver's survey placed it. The second photograph showed Gary arguing with another neighbor. The third displayed a freshly moved fence. I looked up. "What is this?" Arthur nodded sadly. "That was my old neighbor. Gary claimed she'd built her fence in the wrong place." "Did she?" "No. She was elderly. Didn't have the money to fight. So she gave up the land." A chill ran down my spine. "You mean, he's done this before?" Arthur looked me straight in the eye. 3 times. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Why wasn't anything done? He gave a weary smile. "Most people settle. They're afraid of legal costs. So Gary keeps pushing." Before leaving, Arthur handed me copies of every photograph. "You'll need these. They show exactly where the original boundary stood years before your grandparents passed away." I thanked him sincerely. His evidence could prove invaluable. Word of the dispute spread quickly through Ashford Hollow. People I'd barely spoken to began stopping me in the village. Some quietly wished me luck. Others simply shook their heads. One afternoon, Mrs. Collins from the cafe sat beside me. "I've wanted to tell you something." I listened. "When Gary first moved here, everyone thought he was charming. What changed? He always wanted a little more. A wider driveway, a larger garden, another few feet. By the time anyone realized, he'd already taken them." It became clear why conversations about Gary always ended abruptly. The village knew. They just believed nothing could be done. The following Monday, another envelope arrived through my letterbox. There was no stamp, no return address. Inside, I found only a single photograph. It showed my grandparents standing beside the old boundary fence nearly 15 years earlier. Across the back, someone had written in neat handwriting, "Don't let him erase their legacy." There was no signature, no clue who had delivered it. But whoever it was, they wanted Gary stopped just as much as I did. That evening, my solicitor called. "I've reviewed everything. The surveys, the photographs, the council notices, the witness statements." Then he paused. "Daniel, this is no longer just a neighbor disagreement." "What do you mean?" "We have enough evidence to seek an emergency court injunction." "So he can't build?" "So he can't touch another inch of your property." I looked out of the kitchen window toward the disputed land. Gary was standing beside a stack of bricks, watching my house, almost as if he knew something was coming. I ended the call and quietly said to myself, "Your move is over, Gary," because in less than 48 hours, we wouldn't be arguing across a fence anymore. We'd be facing each other in court. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. 7 days. That was all the time we had to stop Gary from permanently changing the property. If the court refused our request, He could resume construction immediately. And once concrete was poured, undoing the damage would become far more complicated. My solicitor, James Whitmore, arrived at the farmhouse carrying 2 large storage boxes. He placed them on the dining table. "Everything we need is here." I looked inside. Property deeds, historic maps, photographs, survey reports, council notices, witness statements, security camera footage, every piece of evidence we'd collected over the past month. James smiled. "I've handled boundary disputes before, but I've rarely seen one documented this thoroughly." For the next 3 evenings, our dining room became a temporary legal office. We organized documents by date, created timelines, labeled photographs, matched every piece of evidence to the official land records. Nothing would be left to chance. James believed facts won cases, not emotions. One piece of evidence stood out above all the others: the security camera footage. Frame by frame, it showed someone approaching the survey markers after midnight. The face remained hidden beneath a hood, but the distinctive limp was impossible to ignore. Then came another recording. The following evening, the same figure, the same jacket, attempting to pry a steel survey marker from the ground using a crowbar. The marker survived. The camera captured everything. James paused the video. "This proves someone interfered with an official survey. But can we prove it was Gary?" I shook my head. "Not definitively." "Then we won't claim it." He looked at me seriously. "We present facts. We let the judge reach conclusions." That was one thing I admired about James. He never exaggerated. He never guessed. The evidence would speak for itself. The morning of the hearing arrived, with gray skies and steady rain. Ashford County Court was a modest stone building just outside the village. As we entered, I immediately spotted Gary. He wasn't alone. Standing beside him was an expensive-looking solicitor in a tailored navy suit. Gary caught my eye and smiled. Not the friendly smile I'd seen when I first moved in. This one was different, confident, almost mocking. As if he believed he'd already won. Our case was called shortly after 10 o'clock. Inside Courtroom 3, everything felt surprisingly calm. There were no dramatic speeches, no television-style confrontations. Just quiet professionalism. Judge Margaret Ellis entered. Everyone stood. She reviewed the case summary before looking over her glasses. Mr. Harper alleges unlawful encroachment. Mr. Mitchell disputes the legal boundary. She looked at both solicitors. "Let's begin." James stood first. He calmly presented the history of the property, the inheritance, the existing boundary, the official surveys, the council's stop work notice. Every statement was supported by documents. No speculation, only evidence. Judge Ellis examined each exhibit carefully, occasionally making handwritten notes. Then Oliver Grant took the witness stand. He explained his qualifications. 21 years as a licensed surveyor, hundreds of completed boundary surveys, professional accreditation. James asked a simple question. "Mr. Grant, can you state your conclusion?" Oliver nodded confidently. "The fence erected by Mr. Mitchell is approximately 2.8 meters inside Mr. Harper's registered property. Are you certain?" "I am." "What supports that conclusion?" "Historic land records, GPS measurements, existing underground boundary markers, and county survey archives." Gary's solicitor stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Grant, is surveying an exact science?" Oliver smiled politely. "It's as exact as modern technology allows." "So mistakes happen?" "They can. Did you make one?" "No." The solicitor changed tactics. Could previous surveys have been inaccurate? Oliver replied without hesitation. If every survey conducted over the last 50 years reached the same conclusion, the likelihood is extraordinarily low. The courtroom fell silent. Next, Sarah Bennett from the planning department testified. She confirmed Gary's approved garage plans, then produced aerial maps. Judge Ellis leaned forward. So the approved garage was never authorized for the disputed land? No, Your Honor. And construction exceeded the approved footprint? Yes. Gary shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time, his confidence seemed to fade. Then came the photographs Arthur Collins had provided. James carefully displayed each one. This photograph was taken in 2005. The original fence appeared exactly where Oliver's survey placed the legal boundary. Another photograph. Same fence. Same location. Another. Still unchanged. Judge Ellis examined each image closely. She looked toward Gary. Can you explain this? Gary finally took the witness stand. He straightened his tie before speaking. My father always told me that fence was misplaced. James remained calm. Do you have any written records supporting that claim? No. Any surveys? No. Any registered maps? No. Any photographs? No. So your entire claim is based solely on conversations with your late father? Gary hesitated. Yes. James nodded slowly. No further questions. Gary's solicitor made one last attempt. He produced a yellowed sheet of paper. My client discovered this sketch among his father's belongings. It illustrates the boundary. The paper showed a rough hand-drawn map. No scale, no measurements, no signatures, no survey references. Judge Ellis studied it briefly, then turned to Oliver. What do you make of this? Oliver adjusted his glasses. It's not a legal survey. It's simply a sketch. It carries no evidential weight regarding registered boundaries. The judge quietly placed it aside. Just when it seemed the hearing was ending, James requested permission to present one final exhibit. The court has not yet viewed this video. He connected a laptop to the courtroom monitor. The security footage began playing. The hooded figure appeared, walking along the disputed boundary, stopping beside the survey marker, using a metal bar to pry at the steel pin. Judge Ellis watched silently until the clip ended. She looked directly at Gary. Mr. Mitchell, do you know who this individual is? Gary swallowed. No, Your Honor. James spoke calmly. We're not suggesting identity. We're demonstrating that someone deliberately interfered with officially placed survey markers less than 24 hours after installation. Judge Ellis nodded thoughtfully. After nearly 4 hours of testimony, the judge closed her notebook. I've heard sufficient evidence to make an interim decision. The courtroom became perfectly silent. This court accepts that there is substantial evidence indicating Mr. Harper's claim has legal merit. Gary stared straight ahead, expressionless. Judge Ellis continued, until a final determination is made, Mr. Mitchell is prohibited from carrying out any further construction, excavation, tree removal, or alterations within the disputed area. She looked directly at Gary. Any breach of this injunction may constitute contempt of court. My heart pounded. We hadn't won the case. Not yet. But we had achieved exactly what we came for. The garage couldn't be built. Not another brick. Not another foundation trench. Nothing. As everyone began gathering their papers, Gary slowly walked past me. For a moment, I thought he was finally going to admit defeat. Instead, he leaned close enough that only I could hear him. You think this is over? His voice was almost a whisper. You've only delayed me. Then he smiled. and walked out of the courtroom. I watched him disappear through the heavy wooden doors. Something about that smile bothered me. It wasn't the smile of a man who had just lost. It was the smile of someone who believed he still had one final move left. For the next 2 weeks, the injunction held. Construction stopped. The machinery disappeared. The piles of bricks remained untouched. From the outside, it looked as though the dispute had finally reached a standstill. But appearances can be deceiving. Gary Mitchell wasn't preparing to surrender. He was preparing something else. Every morning, I walked the eastern boundary before starting work around the farmhouse. The temporary court order meant Gary couldn't touch the disputed land. Yet somehow, small things kept happening. Fresh tire tracks appeared overnight. Branches from my hedges were mysteriously broken. Litter began showing up along my side of the fence. Nothing serious enough for another emergency hearing. Just enough to remind me he was still there, still watching, still trying to wear me down. James Whitmore called one afternoon. The court has scheduled the final hearing. When? 3 weeks. That's sooner than I expected. So did I. He paused. The judge wants this resolved before any further damage is done. For the first time, there was an end in sight. During those 3 weeks, we continued strengthening our case. Oliver returned twice to confirm nothing had changed. Sarah Bennett provided updated planning records. Arthur Collins signed a formal witness statement. Even Mrs. Collins from the village cafe agreed to testify about Gary's reputation for moving boundaries. One by one, the pieces came together. Then something unexpected happened. Late one evening, there was a knock at my front door. Standing outside was a young woman I'd never met. She looked nervous. "I'm sorry for coming so late. My name's Emily Foster. Can I help you?" She glanced over her shoulder before speaking. "I used to work for the solicitor who handled Mr. Mitchell's property paperwork years ago." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" She reached into her handbag. "I found something while clearing old storage boxes." She handed me a sealed envelope. "I think it belongs in court." Inside were photocopies of correspondence dating back almost 15 years. One letter immediately caught my attention. It was addressed to Gary Mitchell. The subject line read, "Boundary Enquiry, Eastern Fence." I quickly scanned the page. The solicitor had written, "Following our review of the official land registry survey, we can confirm that the existing fence accurately reflects the legal boundary. Any relocation would require the written consent of the adjoining landowner." I looked back at Emily. "Has Gary seen this before?" She nodded. "Yes. He received the original. So, he already knew the boundary was correct." Emily lowered her voice. "He knew all along." I could hardly believe it. For months, Gary had insisted the survey was wrong, claimed his father knew better, argued that everyone else had made a mistake. Now, there was written proof he'd been told exactly the opposite years earlier. James almost shouted when I emailed him the documents. "This changes everything." How? Until now. Gary could argue he genuinely believed the boundary belonged to him. And now? Now we can demonstrate prior knowledge. He wasn't mistaken. He was fully informed. The morning of the final hearing, the courtroom felt very different. Last time, it had been about uncertainty. This time, it was about accountability. Judge Margaret Ellis entered promptly at 10 o'clock. After reviewing the updated evidence, she invited James to continue. James began with the new correspondence. "Your Honor, we recently obtained records from the files of a retired conveyancing solicitor." He handed copies to the judge and Gary's legal team. Judge Ellis adjusted her glasses and began reading silently. The room became completely still. After nearly 2 minutes, she looked up. "Mr. Mitchell, did you receive this letter?" Gary hesitated. "I don't remember." James remained calm. "The letter bears your address. It references your earlier inquiry. It includes your file number." "Are you saying it was never delivered?" Gary looked toward his solicitor, then quietly replied, "I may have received something." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You may?" James continued. "The significance is straightforward. Years before this dispute began, Mr. Mitchell was formally advised that the existing fence represented the legal boundary." He paused. "Despite that advice, he later moved the fence anyway." Judge Ellis slowly nodded. "I understand." Gary's solicitor stood. "My client disputes the authenticity of these copies." James smiled slightly. "We anticipated that." He called Emily Foster to the witness stand. She explained how the files had been discovered, how the originals had been archived, how the correspondence matched the firm's records. She also confirmed one crucial detail. "I personally scanned these files before the practice closed. They haven't been altered." Gary avoided looking at her. For the first time, he seemed genuinely uncomfortable. Then Oliver Grant was recalled. Using enlarged aerial photographs, he demonstrated exactly how far Gary's fence had crossed the legal boundary. Nearly 3 meters, stretching along almost 60 meters. Judge Ellis studied the images carefully. "That's approximately 180 square meters." "Correct." She looked toward Gary. "So this wasn't a minor adjustment?" "No, Your Honor. It was significant." The judge then reviewed the security footage once more. The missing survey markers, the damaged steel pin, the photographs of the original boundary, the planning violations, the witness statements. Every piece pointed in the same direction. Finally, Judge Ellis closed the case file. She folded her hands, then looked directly at Gary. "Mr. Mitchell, I've listened carefully to every argument presented. You maintained throughout these proceedings that you honestly believed the boundary had been misplaced." She lifted the solicitor's letter. "This document demonstrates that you were informed years ago that the existing fence was legally correct." She paused. "Yet you moved it anyway." The silence inside the courtroom was overwhelming. Gary's solicitor quietly whispered something to him. For several seconds, they spoke in hushed voices. Then Gary slowly stood. He cleared his throat. "I'd like to make a statement." Judge Ellis nodded. "Proceed." Gary looked around the courtroom, then finally at me. "I never intended for this to go this far." James didn't react. Neither did the judge. Gary continued. "I thought, if I moved the fence little by little, no one would notice." A ripple of disbelief spread through the public gallery. He lowered his head. "I was wrong." Those 4 words changed everything. He hadn't simply admitted moving the fence. He had admitted doing it deliberately, and the courtroom recorder captured every single word. Judge Ellis looked down at her notes, then back at Gary. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell." She paused for a long moment. "I believe I have everything I need." The courtroom waited in complete silence, because everyone knew the next words spoken by the judge would determine the future of both properties. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. No one spoke. No one moved. Every eye remained fixed on Judge Margaret Ellis. She adjusted her glasses one final time and looked down at the thick stack of documents before her. Then she began reading her decision. Having considered the evidence presented, including the historical surveys, land registry records, planning documents, witness testimony, photographic evidence, and the defendant's own admission, this court finds overwhelmingly in favor of the claimant, Mr. Daniel Harper. A wave of relief washed over me. Months of stress, sleepless nights, arguments, evidence. It had all led to this moment. Judge Ellis continued. The legal boundary is confirmed to be the one established by the registered surveys. The fence erected by Mr. Gary Mitchell constitutes an unlawful encroachment onto Mr. Harper's property. She paused. The defendant knowingly relocated the boundary despite receiving legal advice confirming its original position. Her voice became firmer. This court considers that conduct to have been deliberate. Gary stared at the floor. He didn't look up once. The judge turned another page. Accordingly, the court orders the following. Everyone in the courtroom leaned forward. First, Mr. Mitchell shall remove the unlawfully erected fence within 21 days. Second, all encroaching structures, foundations, and construction materials located upon Mr. Harper's land shall be removed entirely at the defendant's expense. Third, the original boundary shall be restored under the supervision of an independent licensed surveyor. She looked directly at Gary. Failure to comply will authorize enforcement officers to carry out the work, with all costs recovered from the defendant. But she wasn't finished. Fourth, the defendant shall replace the mature oak trees and landscaping destroyed during the dispute. If replacement trees of comparable maturity cannot reasonably be obtained, financial compensation shall instead be awarded. I thought about my grandfather. Those oak trees had been planted the year I was born. Nothing could truly replace them. But at least, someone had finally acknowledged what they meant. Judge Ellis read the final order. Fifth, the defendant shall pay all reasonable legal costs incurred by Mr. Harper. The courtroom fell silent once again. Gary's solicitor slowly closed his notebook. Without saying a word, he knew the case was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters from 2 local newspapers waited near the entrance. Apparently, a neighbor dispute involving forged claims, planning violations, and months of courtroom hearings had attracted far more attention than anyone expected. As James and I stepped outside, a journalist approached. Mr. Harper, how do you feel after today's judgment? I smiled politely. I'm relieved. This was never about winning. It was about protecting my grandparents' home. She nodded before turning toward Gary, but he ignored every question. He climbed into his car and drove away without saying a single word. Over the following week, letters arrived from neighbors I'd barely met. Some simply congratulated me. Others shared stories I'd never heard before. One elderly couple wrote that Gary had tried to convince them years earlier that part of their driveway belonged to him. Another neighbor claimed he'd attempted to move a hedge during the previous owner's illness. The pattern was unmistakable. He had spent years testing people's boundaries, quite literally. Exactly 21 days after the judgment, Oliver Grant returned to supervise the restoration. 2 contractors hired by Gary arrived shortly after sunrise. Their first job, removing the illegal fence. I stood quietly near the farmhouse as the panels came down one by one. The fresh timber that had caused so much trouble disappeared faster than it had been installed. By midday, the entire false boundary was gone. For the first time in months, I could clearly see the full width of my land again. The contractors then uncovered the unfinished garage foundations. Concrete footings stretched across the disputed strip. Oliver marked the legal boundary with bright survey paint. Everything beyond that line had to go. The demolition equipment arrived the next morning. A hydraulic breaker smashed through the concrete. By late afternoon, there was almost nothing left. Watching those foundations disappear, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Closure. Gary never came outside. His curtains remained closed throughout the entire process. The workers carried out their instructions in silence. No arguments. No shouting. No excuses. Only the sound of machinery correcting months of unnecessary conflict. 3 days later, a landscaping company arrived. They removed broken stumps, leveled the ground, prepared fresh soil. Oliver supervised the installation of a brand new boundary fence. This one followed the exact GPS coordinates recorded in the land registry. Every post, every panel, every measurement, verified twice. When the final section was secured, Oliver smiled. There, that's where it always belonged. A week later, young oak trees were delivered. They weren't as large as the originals. Nothing could replace 40 years of growth. But as I helped plant them, I remembered something my grandfather used to say. The best time to plant a tree was years ago. The second best time is today. I gently packed soil around the final sapling. It felt like starting over. That evening, I sat on the farmhouse porch watching the sunset. The restored fence stretched across the eastern boundary, exactly where it had stood for decades. The garden looked peaceful again. For the first time since inheriting the property, I felt completely at home. Then I noticed movement next door. Gary stepped outside carrying a cardboard box, then another. Over the next hour, a removal van pulled into his driveway. Furniture, boxes, the garden tools, everything was being loaded. Mrs. Collins from the cafe happened to walk past and quietly said, "I heard he's selling." I looked across the fence. "Really?" She nodded. Some people can live next to a neighbor they wronged. She paused. Others can't live with themselves. A few weeks later, a for sale sign appeared outside Gary's house. By the end of the summer, it had been replaced with another sign. Sold. The man who had spent years trying to take someone else's land had lost the only place he ever called home. As I looked across the restored boundary one final time, I realized something my grandfather had always believed was true. You can build fences to divide people, or you can build them to respect one another. The difference is knowing exactly where the line should be.